Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. So this is the Slow Fish 2021 session on Blue Commons 101, and I just want to emphasize that that is 101. So this is a come as you are session. We welcome questions at all levels, and we will backgrounds and areas of expertise today. So I am the editor-in-chief of National Fisherman Magazine, a commercial fishing publication that covers the entire U.S. domestic fleet, and I'll be your host. Today, we're going to hear from several independent commercial fish harvesters who will discuss the frontline and localized effects of large-scale ocean-based development like net pen fish farming, oil and gas extraction, massive wind farm arrays, and some marine conservation initiatives. Harvesters have little control over the health of the fisheries on which they depend, which is made much worse by a coordinated global effort to commodify the oceans under the guise of the blue economy. We're also going to hear from industry experts who will help guide our conversation into global and localized impacts of the blue economy's widespread privatization and consolidation of community-based fisheries. As we move forward with our presentations, I encourage all of you to think about what it means to value and contribute to a successful and thoughtfully managed blue commons. And we'll get into what blue commons means later for some of you who might have questions on that. So the Blue Commons Initiative seeks a collaborative approach to managing the ocean as a shared resource, providing equal and fair access to opportunities to fish for and grow seafood responsibly. First, I'd like to welcome Seth Macenko, a professor of marine affairs at the University of Rhode Island.
Okay, I'll assume this is working. My task was to provide a sort of an overview. Apologies to Aretha Franklin for ripping her off for part of my. Let's get going here. The outline I was presented here is on the screen, and then I put below it my initial outline. Upon reflection, I'm not sure I fully discharge either of those plans, but let's get going. The blue economy, blue growth, what is it? And I'm assuming that some of you will be quite familiar with this and some of you will have no. In the beginning, as near as I can figure out, this is certainly not my area of complete academic expertise, let me clarify that. In the beginning, a lot of this is coming out of several United Nations efforts, the small island developing states, and also in particular what's known as the Rio +20 conference on sustainable development 2012. Both of those UN initiatives have a similar emphasis on, this is sort of their language, not mine, transformational change away from business as usual and equity in the transformation process. Now, it's not just the UN, and it's not just in the past. Here's a very recent article in the British journal Nature that I've put up on the screen. You can see it's just a few days ago, actually. Enabling conditions for an equitable and sustainable blue economy. So there you see this talk about a blue economy, but this emphasis on equity. And essentially the blue economy sort of metaphor is perceiving of the oceans as this last great frontier for economic development, but at least initially, and also in these authors' eyes, economic development done differently than in the past, with the great sort of inequalities in wealth distribution that we see around the world. And that publication in Nature contains this sentence, which I'm sort of calling the blue holy grail. What's being talked about or aspired to is, quote, a blue economy that's socially equitable, environmentally sustainable, and economically viable. And that's sometimes referred to as this sort of triple bottom line. You hear all this kind of talk. But in that same publication, and I encourage people, if they're interested in this, to look at that. If you can access my presentation later, all of the links are shown in the slides. Those same authors, and in general, I think it's a very admirable paper, but they have a sentence like this, where they say that it's access to natural resources is not really the stumbling block. but factors such as national stability, corruption, and infrastructure, which can be improved through targeted investments and cross-scale cooperation. And here's on my outline, I said what I wanted to do was sort of emphasize paying attention to the words people use and just how they talk. So these phrases that are in there, targeted investments, cross-scale cooperation. I don't, maybe I'm being too harsh, but this sounds like MBA business school speak. So there's a lot of literature, and I'm just showing you a tiny bit of it under different sort of headings: blue economy, blue growth. In all of them, there's an emphasis on investments. And I'm asking this sort of question: a rising tide lifts all boats, or is this what I have called in some of my own work, my own publications, strategically benign rhetoric? And that is, it all seems, well, the triple bottom line: win, win, win. And I've a couple of my slides here sort of boiled down. I want some take-home messages for you. One is just, I really question, and I hope others do, this emphasis on growth and on investment. This is designed, at least in the early UN documents, as a counterpart to business as usual, and yet it's got the same emphases. And so the question I'm asking there on the slide is, can the thinking that brought you the problem solve the problem? And the problem being sort of unequal, unequitable economic development. And the oceans are being perceived as this last great frontier for, an economic playground that hasn't been tapped. And yet, it seems to me that what they're describing is, in fact, business as usual. And here, I'm quoting from an article by someone named Andrea Nightingale. The slogan of the blue economy must be reevaluated. It has been corrupted. And I agree with Andrea completely. The early emphasis on equity seems to have been lost. So take-home message number 2, I want to give full credit to others. If you read only one thing, read this article by Andrea Nightingale. It's a little bit hard to find. I'm not sure it's available in its original form. So I've put a link there where you can find the article in a sort of a repository. It's not the original source. But this is, full credit. This is a really well-written, really thoughtful article that explores a lot of what I'm just giving you a very brief overview of. And he's very sort of methodical in saying, well, here's what the literature or here's what the documents say, and here's the sort of the logical problems with that. So I commend this article highly. I should say here that most of my work was sort of before the so-called blue economy. And back then, we just called it privatization. Or as I say on the slide, fisheries came first. So I thought I'd show these next couple of slides. This is a document that came out in 2014, so a little bit dated, towards investment in sustainable fisheries. So there again, here's that key sort of marker phrase, investment. Who is it? Well, Environmental Defense Fund, the Prince's Charities, and something called 50 and 10. Now the Prince's Charities, well, that's Prince Charles. Okay. But what's really interesting to me in this document, so back to this, that's the title page. What's really interesting is the title heading of chapter 1, Introducing Fisheries as Investable Propositions. Remember, I'm sort of stressing, pay attention to the language that people are using. Targeted investments, cross-scale cooperation, fisheries as investable propositions. And here I'm having some fun. I was thinking about this presentation. And, what is this? And what is it with this business speak language? But then I remembered a very famous, I guess I'm showing my age here, a very famous review in Rolling Stone magazine. You can see the date there in the corner, 1970, so 51 years ago, by Grail Marcus, a very esteemed cultural critic, a music critic. And Marcus was reviewing a new release at the time from Bob Dylan. And it's quite a famous review because he opened it with this line: "What is this shit?" And pardon my language, but that's my reaction to a lot of the rhetoric that's in this blue economy movement and blue economy literature. Whatever else it is, I call it strategically benign rhetoric. It sounds good. It sounds like everybody wins, but what's going on? Well, one of the things that I was supposed to do was sort of zero in on the USA. Okay, well, this is fortuitous because just the other day, former Senator John Kerry, now special presidential envoy for climate, gave a talk at something called the Monaco Blue Initiative. This is a little bit like the Davos meetings, right? Remember, this started out as something that the small developing island states were pushing as a sort of an antidote to systemic underdevelopment and poverty. But now they're discussing it in Monaco. Okay, so what did Special Envoy Kerry say? The next several slides are direct from this document, which are his actual remarks as delivered, not the printed, but what he actually said. So he's pointing out that they want to focus, or they want to look at offshore renewable energy. That's probably wind energy, but maybe some other things. Have to protect and restore our coastal blue carbon. Blue carbon is one of the buzzwords. And decarbonize the international shipping sector. Well, okay. But this sentence was particularly striking. The climate market, the effort to change our energy policy, will be the largest market the world has ever known. Boy, you can just hear the venture capital firms on Wall Street salivating, it seems to me. I mean, this is about markets. This is about money. The Envoy Kerry then said, the fact is that fishing is now a major crisis. And here I channeled Scooby-Doo, but he goes on and says, well, actually, the problem is large vessels fishing out on the high seas. And I'm saying, well, okay, at least that left the small-scale fisheries out of that problem statement. And then what is the U.S. doing? Well, conserving 30% of U.S. lands and waters. That sounds a little bit like the ubiquitous talk in marine policy circles to set aside 30% of the ocean's surfaces as marine protected areas. Natural carbon storage, offshore wind energy, and reducing carbon emissions from the global shipping sector. So back to the things that he mentioned in the first part of his talk. And now here in closing, and when I was reading this, I remembered a graduate professor of mine that said, well, you know, if you really want to get to the meat of something, just read the beginning, the first sentence and the last sentence, and as much of the middle as you need to. Well, here's his last sentence. We have to apply every lever to create a future for the ocean that is biodiverse, climate resilient, and free from carbon pollution, because the health of our ocean is central to our economies, our ecosystems, our communities, and to life itself on the planet. All right, it all sounds good. But what happened to the emphasis on equity? It's not there, right? There was that great celebratory sentence about creating the largest market the world has ever known. But all of that early emphasis on equity and addressing sort of past wrongs in economic development models, it's not there. And I think this is really important to a crowd of what I presume are mostly sort of small-scale fishers and people interested in small-scale fishers. And I said earlier that fisheries came first. And I want to give you an example. Back in 2009, when the New England Fishery Management Council was about to construct their version of what we now call catch shares, but it's a privatization program. Something sprang into being called mission markets. And they had a glossy web page, and you used to be able to find it. You'll see there, it sort of says sustainable fisheries. Well, what was mission markets going to do? Here, they're going to provide investors opportunities to financially support sustainable fisheries. And how's that going to work? Well, they're going to support local communities by purchasing catch shares and leasing them out to local fishermen at below market rates. And I said at the time in 2009, that's an interesting business proposition for Wall Street, doing things at below market rates. Well, in preparing for this talk, I said, whatever happened to mission markets? Because I kind of knew that they had disappeared, but I thought, well, let's verify that. And if you do enough Google searches, you can come up with a number of these things. The last activity that I could find of mission markets was in 2015. And you can see on the screen here, they actually did get two people to donate over $1 million to them. They got one team member, that's their founder, and that's in 2015. It's completely disappeared. So I guess the good news is to people that are worried about some of this blue economy stuff is that some of it doesn't add up, and maybe it will disappear like mission markets did. But I think fisheries privatization was just the tip of the iceberg. And in the blue economy, blue growth scheme of things, fisheries are small change. And the reason I say that is, well, there's a couple of reasons. One is many of the most important fisheries around the globe are already privatized. And the real killing, the real financial profit is made in the initial transition from a public asset to a private asset. So the specter of these large windfall gains in the blue economy isn't going to come from fisheries. And maybe more importantly, or equally important, fisheries are in the way of many future private ownership rights. You're not going to get the blue economy with this large-scale private investment. The paper I recommended that people look at by Andrea Nightingale goes into, for example, Credit Suisse, the big Swiss financial giant. They're making moves in this arena. Firms like that aren't going to do this without the security of private property rights. A lot of this could be interpreted as a struggle to create and then claim or garner private property rights in the oceans. We've seen that in fisheries, but my argument is that's relatively small potatoes compared to what's potentially at stake in privatizing all the resources of the owners of the oceans. But if you have fishery property rights out there, those are in the way of potential aquaculture rights. They're in the way of potential wind farm rights. So I don't see, and I don't think it's an accident that in the end, there, Envoy Kerry, his only remark about fisheries was that they're a problem. Now, granted, he was focusing on large industrial scale fisheries, but there was no mention of the blue economy and how that could be used to create this triple bottom line for small scale fishers. So my last message, and this is where I'll leave you, is I'm talking about the proponents, their blue revolution isn't likely to be your blue revolution. I think there are a lot of small scale fishing people all around the world that are feeling a lot of pressure and would like to see a transformation. But the transformation that's being proposed by Wall Street investors, I don't think is the transformation that's going to benefit you. And I think today's session is about trying to envision an alternative to that, because the trajectory of the one version of a blue revolution is quite clear. So I'm going to stop here, and hopefully the presenters that follow will give you a lot of food for thought about what could be an alternative that we're calling blue commons instead of blue private economy. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Seth. That was fantastic. That's a great introduction to this topic. So who we have up next is Jason Jarvis, who's a Rhode Island quahog fisherman. And I would like to ask before we move on to his presentation, for everyone watching to think about fisheries size and scope, which Seth just brought up, and the broad and sweeping generalizations that people tend to make about fisheries when they're talking about fisheries in a big conversation. They say things like fisheries are X, and that doesn't get to the point of fisheries being managed individually by different nations, differently in different states. And Jason specifically is a state waters fisherman. Is that right, Jason? Right. So he's going to talk about what that means for him as a fisherman, and hopefully give us a little more context to, strategic investment in fisheries and what that means on a global scale. Thanks, Jason. I think you're still muted. Can you unmute?
So Jason, I suggest hopping out and hopping back in real quick, and that should do it. If not, refresh your page.
Thanks,
These are some of the quirks that we have with hopping in and hopping out, but we're rolling with it as best we can.
That's right. Sometimes we have to go a little slower, right? So I just wanted to say really quick about Seth's presentation. Oh, are you back in, Jason? I can't hear you. All right, we're going to try again. So anytime I hear strategic and investment, I feel pretty confident that whatever's coming next is not going to be applied with equity and highly unlikely with sustainability in mind. So that was really eye-opening. I mean, I've certainly taken in some of these points that he made, over the years, a little bit more piecemeal. So seeing it all compiled there together was really certainly eye-opening for me.
Absolutely, and then when you get into the investment arms of like blue bonds, as Michelle put in the chat section.
Yeah, the new blue chip, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. And what it does is it displaces local community-based fisheries, local community-based management of their own resources, and
right.
Talk about complete disemboweling of any kind of equity in the participation of their own local resource.
Right. I think the misnomer being the rising tide lifts all boats. This is not about a rising tide. It's about a crowding of the harbor. You start bringing cruise ships into your harbor, where are your fishing boats going to go? Oh, no.
Jason, what I might suggest doing is just logging out and logging back in all the way. I know it's kind of tedious, but maybe what we can do is try to move down the agenda a bit. Sure. Until Jason can actually come back on. Oops. Sorry about that. Yeah, so until Jason can actually come back on us, why don't we try? We've got Linda Benkin and Stephen Rhodes out in Alaska, and they're actually ready to go. So maybe we can try that.
All right. Take it away, Linda and Stephen. Thanks so much for being here. I hope your Wi-Fi holds up.
Yeah, it looks like we're on. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, and I think I can hear Stephen too.
Okay, well, I'm going to try the share screen thing first and see if. Okay, we can get that to work. All Or it doesn't look like it's working, does it? You guys seeing? I don't
That
know.
looks
Steve, can you select it for me?
You're there. You're there, Linda. All you have to do is go into click on your presentation. So you had it. You had your presentation open. Try it again.
Okay.
Yep. And now just start the presentation.
Okay. I'll just work from here. Great.
You're in presenter mode. Can you go to like start the play from start? I think is what you want to. There you go. Perfect.
Okay, great. Awesome. All right. Well, I can't see any of you anymore, but I guess that's how this is supposed to work. So I am Linda Benkin. I'm director. I'm a commercial fisherman, first and foremost, based in Sitka, Alaska, Klinkonani land, and I'm director of Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association. So this Blue Commons issue has certainly been a big focus of ours for a while. Alaska has moved into a number of limited entry and quota share programs that have had positive and negative benefits. So something that we're always thinking about and evaluating. But our focus is on promoting sustainable fisheries and thriving fishing communities. And we do that through a range of, or come at that in a number of different ways. So in the policy development forum right now, we are involved state, local, federal, national forums working to promote our fisheries and keep the ocean healthy. And I would say, and Seth mentioned the 30 by 30 initiative, which is taking real center stage for me right now. The other way we come at this is through collaborative research and involving fishermen in developing solutions to conservation issues that they develop or that are dropped on us by managers, where fishermen are working together among themselves to promote their fisheries and better stewardship, or working with scientists. And that's really going to be the focus of Stephen's part of this. So I'm not going to say too much more about that. And on the education piece, we work to help our fishermen be better at what they do. So finding areas where they are looking for more information or to build skills, and offering classes and workshops to support them, but then also working to educate the public on how hard our fishermen work to keep the resource healthy and how important it is for them to support those works in their choices as consumers. We also have a number of young fishermen initiatives right now. I'll talk about those a little bit more in a minute, but to help the next generation of fishermen get started in what has become a really challenging industry. Our group is really defined by the values that bring us together. Our boats are small scale. That's my boat. Of course, you couldn't get out of here without a picture of my boat. And our fisheries are community-based. We have members in 18 Alaska rural communities. We also have members who spend winters or part of their year down in Washington or Oregon and come up here to fish. But they are fishing families and people who really see fishing both as a livelihood and a way of life that supports their independence as well as their commitment to a healthy resource. All of our programs really live in that nexus of, if you take care of the resource, it will take care of you, that it really goes together to promote a healthy resource, to involve fishermen in stewardship, and that the fisheries will be healthier as long as the people who live in these coastal communities who are advocates for healthy oceans are also the ones who have long-term access. And the program Stephen's going to talk about, our Fishery Conservation Network. I just wanted to say a few things about other programs in case people want to follow up with questions. But we do run a community supported fisheries program. The real difference between our program and a lot of other CSF programs is the profits from our distribution or sale of seafood to communities around Alaska and shipments to the lower 48 support our conservation work and our young fishermen work. And another big difference is we made a very conscious decision to work with our local processors, recognizing their importance to the social fabric of our communities. So Seafood Producers Cooperative in particular is a strong partner in our CSF. It's a fisherman-owned cooperative, and something that most of our members are deeply invested in keeping healthy. So we work with our local processors rather than cutting them out of that seafood supply chain, but do the direct-to-consumer sort of public outreach part of a CSF. We also in 2020 responded to need by our fishermen donating a lot of seafood, and then also our organization and our partner organization, Alaska Sustainable Fisheries Trust, securing funding to provide over 600,000 meals to families in need, with a real focus on the rural and native communities in Alaska, as well as the Pacific Northwest, as we heard of a lot of families who were looking in trouble and also really value seafood as culturally and nutritionally central to meeting that need. Our Crew Apprentice program, we give people a first and safe chance to get out and work as fishermen, as crew on commercial fishing boats after running them through some preparation and sort of selectively choosing skippers who will really focus on making sure it's a safe and positive experience. We have curriculum that we have developed to help our skippers be ready to do a good job and people coming into the program be prepared. And those are all materials we are happy to share widely with anybody else trying to launch similar programs. Local Fish Fund is maybe a little bit of that mission market that Seth talked about, where we have been able to secure some foundation funding to help young people come into the quota share fisheries with much lower risk and much lower down payment than any other loan program out there. And by participating in stewardship and leadership programs, they are able to reduce the interest that they pay on their loans. So it's a sort of first step into the fisheries. We try to mentor them through that process and help them take care of the resource and be leaders in the future for maintaining that healthy resource. But we don't do any of that without a whole lot of support and really important partnerships with our local processors, with coalitions across this country, and with people here in the state that share our commitment to healthy fisheries and healthy small-scale community-based side of the fisheries and their access to the healthy resource. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen and let him share his screen. If I can remember how to stop sharing mine. There we go. And over to you, Stephen.
Okay, I've got a few screens going here. So my name is Stephen Rhodes, and I live in Sitka, Alaska, and I've been fishing up here for quite a few years with every kind of hook and pot that you can play with. I've done sea cucumbers and sea urchins all the way down into Oregon, and I've now retired from fishing, and I work for Seafood Producers Co-op in Sitka. I work a lot with Alpha as a member volunteer, and I have to remind all of our international members out there on these meetings that Alaska is officially not a part of Canada. There was some big confusion when I went to Asia and talked about these things because they all assumed that Canada was definitely owning Alaska. So Southeast Alaska is a wonderful place to live and fish. It's part of the Tongass National Forest. It's the largest rainforest in the country. And all of our communities up here on the coast depend on commercial fishing. And one of my big interests is making sure that the economies of the coast exist in a healthy way and not just based in tourism. We have a few towns that have been taken over by tourism and aren't fishing towns anymore, and that's not where I want to live. Our fleet of boats in Southeast is generally on the smaller size. There's Linda's boat in the middle, and the seafood industry produces about 18% of all the income in Southeast Alaska. and most of it is on boats that you can actually get your mind around. We don't have any very many giant boats operating here. So my focuses on slowfish are advocating for sustainable policy in the fisheries, both on our state management and federal management of fisheries, trying to creatively solve problems that the small boat fleet is running into and making that an affordable solution, and partnering with our fisheries management. We are extremely lucky in Alaska to have most of our managers understand that their job is not to be the police of the fishermen, but to figure out how to get the fishermen operating in a way that they can have fish long term. And it's really a unique set of people up here. I've never run into it in federal or state fisheries in other states. And I really like to foster those relationships. And once again, making sure that the economics are viable as long as the ecology is viable. Alpha has been doing a lot of successful projects over the years. Part of the Southeast Alaska trawl closure was Alpha. We have no trawlers in the Southeast area. We started a fisheries conservation network that I'm going to talk quite a bit about. We've been doing bottom mapping and bycatch mapping in goals of reducing the bycatch. We've been working on reducing sperm whales avoidance, or increasing the avoidance, but reducing the interaction with sperm whales on longline gear, and fostering those partnerships with science and management. So the Fisheries Conservation Network was founded to take new angles at solving the problems and to build these stewardship relationships, that the fishermen need a voice in management. And we have found that if we participate in management problems, we get the credentials to have a voice in those conversations. And it's problems that are facing in current fishing practices. A lot of the science that we see in fisheries is mostly for science sake, and fishermen want practical, launchable solutions. And that's where a lot of what we've been working on. And getting fishermen to share their data has been an uphill battle, but it turned into some pretty neat effects. A lot of fishermen these days are using bottom mapping software, where they take their GPS and their depth and they start tracking out the bottom and building a map. And we've worked with the hardware and software manufacturers to come up with some cheaper ways to get this on the boats to help people avoid bycatch and reduce their fuel burn to get their target fishery. So each red dot in the slide there is a data point from my boat going out, setting gear, hauling gear, and coming back in. And one boat at a time, it takes quite a while to map the bottom. And we've asked fishermen to join together and pool their data. And this is our current data set from our fishermen. We have 140 million soundings now. It's the best map of the ocean in Southeast Alaska that any agency or private group has. And it's gotten fishermen to show us exactly where they fish, which is their most highly guarded secret, but they're getting more out of it than they're putting in. And this has really brought the fishermen and management to the table. Here's another view of it. This is the chart that we get from NOAA data, and then this is the end result of our group data. We now have NOAA and the state of Alaska have requested and are borrowing our data set to do fisheries biomass estimates and planning their surveys. And they're talking more to us, more to the fishermen, and vice versa. It's really brought all of us closer together and talking about our resources. And one of the tricks is that fishermen are putting in a little bit, but they're getting a lot more back out. That if it was a one-to-one trade, fishermen would not participate. But we started out by collecting public data, and we brought it back in with our private data and then blending it all together. And now we have enough that fishermen aren't afraid that we are going to figure out where their best spot is. And they actually come to our meetings, that they are closer to the policy initiatives that Alpha is working on because of this data project. So this has become the carrot to get them to be part of the conversation. One of the first projects that the FCN did was the Bycatch hotspot mapping, that we asked fishermen to fill out their logbooks and say, where are the areas where you got your target species and where are the areas where you got the bycatch you weren't looking for. And the hope of this project was that if someday we come into a conservation mode where we can reduce our bycatch to keep the targeted fisheries open. And we haven't hit that point, but even the process of mapping has reduced the bycatch of our fleet without any new rules to mandate that. So just by asking our members to pay attention and share the data, that has also helped their behavior out on the ocean. So as a group, we are, trying to increase the target species. That we believe that if you're efficient in getting your target catch, whether that's a quota or a limited entry, you're going to spend less fuel, less time, fewer hooks in the ocean, and that's going to reduce bycatch overall. And lower expenses puts more money into the pockets of deckhands and boat owners. And all of this gets them back to engaging with science and management. One of the cycles of fishing that I'm pretty concerned with is, how do we make sustainable fishing also include sustainable crew? That we have a graying of a fleet in Alaska, and trying to figure out how to get young people to get the experience, the financing, the training to run a sustainable business into the future. And this is the cycle that I tried to foster in my career, and the one that I followed was that I became a skipper of that boat, and then I bought a boat. And I've had crewmen do the same, where they, sorry, my phone is ringing in the background here. And that's a really important part of that cycle for me. And getting closer with our management groups, we've done work with National Geographic, Scripps, and knowing the first names of the people in management at NOAA and ADF&G is extremely powerful. And they now call us when they have questions about the fisheries to see where their rules will lead before they actually get written, which has been pretty exciting. Here's our friend Melanie Brown, who is a great icon of that fisheries management ecology harvester relationship. We're looking for long-term solutions that can work in every community. And one thing we've discovered is to find the local innovators in the community and support what they're doing. That if you do a top-down project and bring in a solution, fishermen aren't going to buy into it, that there's a resistance to outside science. And if you can find the fishermen who support the sustainability, then you target them, get them involved, and also working with the consumers who support these kinds of ideas and activities. It's my friend John with one of the biggest black cod ever. And what Alpha and the FCN can share are lots of ideas for small boats that really push the game one boat at a time. And on my world, my fisheries politics always says more fish because I'm a harvester. But for me, more fish doesn't mean more fish now. It means more fish long-term for generations to come. And that's what I got. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That's great context for the next part of our conversation is actually going to be similar small scale fishery. We're going to try to go back to Jason Jarvis and have him talk about small scale fisheries on the East Coast. Anybody who has questions, I have a couple of questions for Linda and Stephen, but I think we're going to save those for the end. So I want to say thank you, but please don't go anywhere. So we're going to try to bring Jason back, and if we can't get his mic working, then we're going to move on to Andrea Nightingale. So I'm hoping that we can pull Jason back in, and otherwise, Andrea, could you just let us know in the chat if you're ready to roll? That would be great. Okay, Andrea's here. All right. So one of the things that I wanted to have people thinking about, a really good point that Stephen brought up, is this science for the sake of science. And we've seen that a lot with what used to be fisheries science grants from the Saltonstall Kennedy Fund, which is a federal program. And a lot of those grants are going to universities and colleges, which is great, except that the missions that they've used to fund that research, or to create applications for those grants, has slowly transitioned over time away from sort of fisheries forward science and data to just whatever works for them in terms of what their projects are at the university, which isn't necessarily helping our fisheries. Oh, we've got Jason. All right, Jason, I see that you've got audio and video. Can you give us a test? Yay! Awesome.
All right.
Great. All right, Jason, I'm going to let you take it over. Again, Jason is a quahog fisherman from Rhode Island, and he fishes in state water. So take it away, Jason.
Very good. I'd like to thank everybody participating. And I'm actually what you consider a waterman or a artisanal commercial fisherman. So I'm part of a large amount of Rhode Island vessels that are under 30 feet, and we're involved in multi-species fisheries. So quahogs being one of them, and then multiple other shellfish, finfish, and pretty much anything we're allowed to catch. If you have a smaller boat, that's kind of how you have to make a living here. Besides that, I'm also a commercial representative for the Rhode Island Marine Fisheries Council. So I'm one of the two commercial representatives that represent the stakeholders in the commercial fishing business or industry. But what I'm talking about today is a very good example of something that's been managed by the state and fairly well. And that's the majestic quahog, which I'm going to put up to my camera and you can see it. There it is. It became very famous from Family Guy, which I think is hilarious, but most people didn't know what a quahog was until they watched Family Guy. So on top of that, pretty much since recorded time in North America, quahogs have been a part of our history, the native culture, and they were used for pretty much a symbol of stature and honor before the colonials decided to turn it into a monetary system or currency. They were brought into mainstream fame and fortune, I guess, by a couple of factors. We had a large oyster industry in this state, and then that industry was disrupted by pollution, world wars, and then eventually the hurricane in 1938. So at that point, Narragansett Bay had a thriving oyster industry, and the combination of pollution from industry and other factors wiped out the oysters and brought rise to the quahog. I guess Blount Seafood was the company that actually pushed for the quahog as a food source. So again, after all of these factors that did damage to the shellfish industry, and other parts of the bay where you couldn't harvest anything that was edible, and then came Save the Bay, and they came in and changed that around. But again, here we are, modern times, and we're facing similar issues, and they're related to somewhat the blue economy. I mean, it's chlorinating sewage. The discharge has led to a decline in the good bacteria and other nutrients that you need for healthy shellfish and healthy fish. It's kind of like probiotics for the gut. The treatment of sewage has now wiped out all of the good bacteria in the bay. And, I mean, how is this related to the blue economy and blue commons? Think of it this way. And modern man has always believed that dumping waste and trash and other caustic chemicals into our oceans and rivers, it's an inexpensive and safe way to get rid of industrial human waste. And we eventually discovered that the impact of that was pretty sad and scary, and we're still paying for it to this day. But along the way came another crazy solution, which Seth had spoken about earlier. And, this idea that if we, in order to save these fish in our marine ecosystems, let's turn them into private property and commodify them like, they can be sold as stocks on Wall Street. And for most of us in Rhode Island, especially with the quahog industry, the thought of a corporation taking over and privatizing the quahog industry is frightening. That's exactly what happened to our ocean quahogs and sea clams off of our coast. And how this is playing out, I mean, as Seth had said before, look at the wording of what's going on with the blue economy. And I kind of call it the money/real estate grab of our oceans. A few years ago, Lion Capital, their British private equity firm, paid $980 million to own the exclusive rights to nearly a quarter of the supply of clams that dominate America's, canned clam industry. But as I call it, the majestic quahog, it has deep roots in Rhode Island. And it's resisted going down the path of the blue economy and catch share policy. It's remained an important part of Rhode Island culture, Rhode Island commerce. It's actually the Rhode Island state clam. Think about that. And it's harvested for sustenance. It's commercially harvested, and the shell is still utilized by the Narragansetts, the Pequots, and the Wampanoag tribes. Many people local to Rhode Island and people that come here on vacation, some of their big outings have to do with going out and digging quahogs. It's kind of a ritual to the whole thing where, you get your gear together, you get the kids together, and you walk around the pond and you check to make sure you get the lowest tide. And the end result is, next thing you know, you're making clam chowder and clams casino and stuffies and enjoying this beautiful, bounty from the salt ponds, Rhode Island. It's embedded in our history, from wampum beads right up to, seafood festivals and chowder contests. But on a management end, and I think this is where I think Rhode Island has done a good job. Pretty much years ago, people abused the situation and were harvesting polluted clams. And because of that, Rhode Island took a pretty strong approach to managing quahogs. So it's managed with a combination of panels. You have the Shellfish Advisory Panel, and they offer input to the Rhode Island Marine Fishery Council. But this entire process requires public input, workshops, and hearings. Unlike most of the blue economy meetings that go on, where the public's input is hardly ever asked for, and the information itself is normally not put out for the public to see. So between, public hearings, workshops, the state also implements rolling closures of transplant areas. So what the state does, they work with commercial harvesters to harvest clams out of polluted areas. And then we bring these to clean areas, and they stay there for a certain time frame until they're free from pollutants and they're safe for harvest and consumption. And I guess what's really been important and opposite of what's going on in the other fisheries is that Rhode Island is pushing for new entrants into this fishery. We are down by about 900 clam harvesters compared to 20 years ago. So we are intentionally building new entrants into this fishery. There's shellfish, a student shellfish license, and just more incentives for people to get out and do this. So I guess to bring it all into perspective here, we've seen the impact of industry on our ecosystem as a whole, not just in fisheries, I mean, across the country. The pandemic here has given us, some wide-eyed looks at the impact of things on our food supply. I mean, a thriving oyster industry destroyed by industrial pollution, a world war, and then a hurricane. That was 1938. We're still trying to rebuild the wild oyster population in Rhode Island. So the potential for, catastrophic destruction of the shellfish beds, it could happen just from nature or industry. But if the quahog abundance is wiped out by, a money grab of some kind or even natural events, it could be devastating to the economy and even the culture of the state. So I think finding balance within our commons versus commerce is an issue that needs to be addressed. I think a lot of these things get put into play where, cultural importance, historical importance, economic importance, and how this all impacts small coastal communities. I think that gets overlooked. I think we need to learn from our past and that we can't afford to make the same mistakes, especially on a large scale. I think that as modern man can mine the ocean floor, put up 900-foot structures in the ocean, cage fishing pens offshore, drill for natural gas and oil, and think there will be no impact on the delicate balance of this, this complex ecosystem. It's hubris. And I just find that to be the perfect word for this, hubris. It's like, I think the moral of the story is we can't allow greed over need as it relates to, the largest source of protein worldwide. But on a closing note, I think the Rhode Island quahog is a great example of the commons. I mean, it is a resource that is shared by the entire state and many across the country. And on that note, I'd like to, I'll hand it off to the next speaker, and I appreciate you letting me join you.
Thank you so much, Jason. Before you go, I just wanted to ask for you to draw a clear line between your fishery and that surf clam fishery, the offshore, the ocean quahogs and surf clam, because that is the first quota managed fishery in the country. And not everybody totally gets what that means and the distinction between state waters and federal waters.
Yes. So the difference is in Rhode Island, I mean, it's individuals are allowed to have a license to harvest quahogs. And so just about anyone, a student, can get a license to do that. But the industrial surf clam fishery or sea clam fishery is controlled by a handful of people, and they own the quota. They own the sea clams and they own the ocean quahogs. And I mean, comparatively, that is the industrial version of shellfishing. And it's very sad because a lot of people were pushed out of that fishery. So, I mean, right now in Rhode Island, there are some state waters fishermen that harvest sea clams inshore. But there are no large scale clammers in, say, Point Judith. I think there's a couple that still operate out of Bristol, Rhode Island. But the fisheries, that clamming fishery is controlled by a very small percentage of people, and it's yeah, it's sad. It's sad because that was the first corporate / privatized fishery, and it set precedent for the rest, and it's pretty sad.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks
And
for the contact. Go ahead.
But one other note, I wanted to show you what happens to a quahog when I deal with it. That is a piece of wampum.
That's beautiful.
I decided to start making wampum because my wife's a silversmith, and it's a lot of the native tribes don't do it anymore. But I mean, it's a beautiful piece of Mother Nature, and I decided, hey, I'm Bahamian, but I could make some wampum. So from wampum to food, I mean, it's an interesting fishery.
Using the whole animal. Thank you, Jason. Much appreciated. And Jason has to leave soon, but I think, you know, we'd be happy to facilitate some questions back to him if you have any questions as a follow-up. And I think what we're going to do next actually is we're going to move to Andrea Nightingale, who is a professor of sociology and human geography at the University of Oslo. Thank you so much for joining us, Andrea. If you could just unmute yourself, I'm going to let you take over.
Great. Thanks, Jess. And thanks, Jason. That was a fascinating story. And it ties in quite well with what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. How's that look? Looks okay for everyone, I hope. So I'm going to now back up and talk a little bit on a more abstract level about the kinds of basically fisheries governance arrangements that the people have been giving us examples about so far. And I want to contrast it with the logic that lies behind these blue economy initiatives. So, and as I talk about this, I'm going to distinguish between the commons and commoning, and compare both of these a bit to private property and private initiatives. So I bet all of you have heard about the tragedy of the commons, and I hope that most of us on this call know that the tragedy of the commons is actually a tragedy of open access. So academics for the last 30 years have been combating this it's actually a very slim little article that Garrett Hardin wrote on the so-called tragedy of the commons. And in his view, that everybody's self-interest would lead to overexploitation and collapse of the resource. But actually, tons and tons of research has been done across multiple different kinds of resources around the world, and shows that when there is a clear user group and a set of management rules in place, that the tragedy of the commons rarely occurs. Now, I think what we see a lot in fisheries is the fact that the user group or the resource users is not clearly defined enough. And from what I could hear in the Alaska story and also the Rhode Island story, part of what I'm hearing is that those user groups are more closed. It's more clear who can access the fishery. And that's part of what makes it successful in terms of limiting the amount of harvest. So, and I guess I actually just want to back up for 1 minute and say that under the blue economy model, they're looking to use science in a way that is completely different from the way science is being used in Alaska. They're looking to use science to figure out what's the maximum that they can harvest of any one species or in any one place. And then they use that to try to figure out how they can be as profitable as possible. Or, as I think Seth pointed out really well, a lot of the blue economy stuff is actually not about fisheries at all. And I did a little bit of research on the coast of Sweden, where it's the coast between Sweden and Norway. and the fishery there has been reduced to literally a handful of boats. And the municipality has been now tasked with governing the oceans that are attached to their municipality as well as the land. And for the local municipality, this was very intimidating, but they were kind of jumping on to all this narrative of blue economy and blue growth, but not fisheries was a very small part of that vision. It was mostly about offshore energy and tourism and things like that. So I think that for fishing communities, the blue economy is certainly not thinking very much about them. So let's turn to commoning. So can the commons be an alternative to the blue economy? And I want to distinguish between two different kinds of commons that are circulating right now in popular parlance and also in the literature. So one is what's known as common property regimes. And this is the work that Eleanor Ostrom did to combat Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons work, and came up with a number of design principles. My last slide actually lists some of those principles, because while this work was incredibly helpful, it's also a bit limited. So here the focus was on institutions that could manage what are known as common pool resources. So resources that are very difficult to privatize or to fence or to bound. So fish that are a mobile resource maybe doesn't apply quite as much to clam beds, for example, but certainly fin fish in the ocean, they move around. And so it's really hard to kind of keep them in one place and then divide up the fishing grounds so that everybody has access to that population. And so common property regimes are very common, sorry. It's usual to find common property regimes where you have resources that are difficult to fence or bound. But the key thing here, as I mentioned before, is it's a defined group of users, but also, and I think, again, both the Alaska and Rhode Island case points this out, is that they have self-governance rights. So the users have the ability to create the rules under which they are going to operate. And in fisheries, this ability to create rules is highly variable from one fishery to the next, and sometimes even from one species to the next. But it is extremely, or not, I mean, we have examples from all over the world of fishers getting together and creating their own rules, even if those rules are not technically legal. Now, the other kind of commons I want to talk about is what's called commoning. And David is going to come back a while later and speak a bit more about this. But in commoning, it's more, the emphasis is more on the groups and not so much on the resource. So it's really about groups organizing to manage their affairs. And importantly, there's goals beyond just resource governance. So in the commons, what we find is that, and at least for me, if we're looking only at a commons as common property and common property of resources, it's much easier for that to fit within a blue economy logic. So I think we need to be a little bit careful about not getting overly focused on the resource itself and the governance regime around the resource, but rather to expand it a bit more to understand a kind of different way of being in the world. So some communities talk about it as alternative life worlds. Others talk about it as alternative economies. Some have suggested that commoning is about learning to live well with others, and those others include both humans and other species. So on my slide here, I've chosen a reproduction of a painting by Roy Thomas, who's an Anishinaabe artist who died a few years ago. And Roy has said that when he would sit down to paint, that even though he was holding the paintbrush, he was very aware that he was not the only one moving the paintbrush. And what he meant by that was that his connection to his community, to his tribe, to the other life givers, as he calls them in this painting, were also part of what was inspiring his art and helping him to move his paintbrush. And so commoning in itself requires us to go beyond what are known as modern separations. And here they're called modern because it's associated with the kind of rise of Enlightenment thinking and science several hundred years ago that separated nature from culture, economy from life, human from non-human. And we need to start reimagining and rethinking what those relationships are. And many have argued that commoning can be one context for doing that reimagining. So if we want to think about a strategy of the commons instead of a tragedy of the commons, fisheries governance can be a starting point for this work. And I think the Alaska example is a really wonderful one where the, kind of involving fishers in these scientific studies and the gathering of data, kind of creating data for themselves, creating the science they felt they need, becomes a platform for them to become more engaged in the governance of their own resource and hopefully to create a stronger community amongst themselves. So collective governance can be a platform for new relationships that can extend into other aspects of daily life. And in particular, commoning is very much committed to the promotion of non-market rationalities towards livelihood security. So rather than putting growth and profit as our number one goal in managing our fisheries, we put livelihood security, we put sustainability of community, and as Jason just said about the Rhode Island fishery, a kind of sense of long-term ability to harvest from that fishery. And so it's catch over time and not just catch in the moment or profit in the moment. Now, I just want to say that in the commons, and my own work has kind of insisted on this, there is a bit of a darker side. And I personally think it's really important that we acknowledge and we talk about this darker side, because otherwise we go into these commoning relationships and we're so idealistic and excited and everything's going to be great. And then it actually is hard work. And we run into frictions, we run into things happening that we don't want there. And then people kind of give up. Whereas I would suggest that some of these more difficult challenges can be precisely the things that can help hold a commoning effort together over time if people are using it as a productive context to keep revisiting what is it that brings us together, what is it that our goals really are, and how are we going to combat outside threats. So some of the things that happen is that, commoning by definition means that a group of people get together and decide on a common set of goals or a common way of being and a common set of rules in the fisheries. But this automatically creates exclusions. Somebody's going to get left out of this. Somebody's going to be excluded. And those exclusions it's not that they're bad, but rather I think we need to hold into view what kind of exclusions are created. And do we need to revisit some of those exclusions as the commons progresses? A lot of commoning efforts require large amounts of voluntary labor. And in some of my other research in forestry, this has become more and more significant, is the amount of voluntary labor that's required to keep community forestry groups running. So it's important for the commons to be thinking about whether or not there's ways to compensate for some of this voluntary labor, but also to maintain a sense that it's worth it to be investing. And I think, again, in the Alaska example, we had a few moments there and articulations of how people were getting something back from the effort that they were putting in. And finally, that often there can be an uneven distribution of benefits and burdens of both governance and resources. And so kind of managing that unevenness over time and making sure that people don't get burned out or feel like they're being abused or just taken advantage of or excluded is very important. So just to conclude here, I think that successful fisheries commons both create and build from a sense of community. So one of the examples I worked with was a fishery in Scotland, off the west coast of Scotland, that was able to ban mobile gear from their fishing ground. This was a relatively small fishing ground. They spent a long time in a legal battle with the state to try to make it a permanent exclusion. In the end, they didn't really succeed, but now the Marine Protected Area notion is kind of coming in and helping them with that. But nevertheless, the community was already there. It was a small community, but then their attempts at creating a sustainable fishery for themselves helped to create a stronger sense of community. And I think the Okanagan example that we're going to hear about is another really amazing story that speaks to this. Secondly, I think it's really important to have different kinds of ways to secure access rights. So if there's only one way in, a common way in a fishery, ocean fishery, is to own a boat, for example, or to have a fishing license and to have quota. In Scotland, you pretty much need all three of those things. And that's a pretty big barrier to jump over. So in certain communities that we're aware of in Denmark and in other parts of North America, there needs to be attention to how to get access rights to their fishery that can allow for younger members to come in, and for people who don't have as many resources to start with to be able to access the fishery. They all require a lot of commitment. A successful fisheries commons is not going to run itself. You've got to stick with it. And it may not require active management all the time. One example I'm aware of are irrigation commons across the Himalayas, and they're called kulus, and kulus are almost completely invisible until there's a problem. And so the collective and the commoning effort around it only becomes obvious when something has gone wrong. So that's an example where it doesn't require constant effort, but it does require commitment when something does emerge that requires conflict resolution. And I think that in the long term, they're beneficial to individuals, even if in the short term, it can seem like maybe you're sacrificing something, you're sacrificing some of your catch. And I've just got this final bullet point here, struggle, because I think that, I don't think there's a lot of human affairs where there isn't an element of struggle involved, whether that's a struggle against the state, whether it's a struggle against different, larger boats, different kinds of gear, a neighboring community and trying to form your boundary. But often successful commoning efforts will have something to push against. There's a reason for people to need to come together and to kind of protect what they have. And again, like the darker side, I don't think it's necessarily negative. I think it's just something we need to be thinking through and be aware of. So I have some questions, and we can put these back up when we break into small groups, but I'll just present them briefly here. So one is, what is required to create good relationships? If commons and commoning efforts are dependent on relationships, then what do we need to do to create good relationships? And is that the same thing as what is required to maintain them? And I think there's a number of people within this webinar who have a lot of experience around this. And I think it'd be really interesting to share some of your experiences of kind of creating the relations of commoning that you need and then trying to maintain those. And what are the messages that you would give to others who are interested in creating collective change? And then this is echoing something that somebody already had put in the chat. And I'm curious if co-management actually reduces conflict, or if conflict is simply shifted into a forum where it's more productive. Because a lot of these fisheries commons that are interacting with large, powerful nation states like Canada or the United States, by necessity must have a relationship with the state. And that relationship is often one of co-management, where you've got scientists and regulators sitting on a board with local communities. And I just am curious about whether you think it's actually reducing it, or is it just shifting it to a more productive forum? And secondly, are commons more successful when a sense of belonging and community is extended to the resource itself? So to all of life, and not just the fish that you're working with or the people next to you, but everything that is sustaining your life world. So I'm not going to go through these, but I'll leave them up while we talk for a few minutes. These are the rules that I pulled out from Ostrom's work that seem to be the most important in terms of dealing with making common property regimes successful. Now, I think commoning requires something else, because it requires a sense of connection beyond just the individual, the self, and the resource, but to wider parts of life. And also, I think it requires maybe a more explicit commitment to community, which common property regimes, it's more like a commitment to the resource. Okay, I will stop there. If I share my screen, I can't see any of you. Oops, let me go back. Let's see if I can maybe, okay, now I can see you. Great.
Thanks, Andrea. That was fantastic. A great deep dive into some of the most important questions we can be asking today, I think. So what we're actually going to do next is break into our small breakout rooms. And those are numbered, and we're going to be directing people which room to go to. So I'm going to let Collis pop in here and take over that part of the conversation, how we get there.
Should I just log off then, Jessica, or what? How should we keep my, you have a copy of my slides, but I'm just thinking of sharing those questions with the small groups.
I think that they are already set to be shared with the small groups. So I think that is taken care of.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we've got that set up on the Jamboard that Jen set up. So what we're going to do right now, everyone, is first of all, thank you all for joining us. Thank the storytellers so far. I mean, these are really huge thoughts that affect all who are in community fisheries, all in the seafood supply chain, and even you know, those that are seafood eaters. They're very important when we start thinking about our relationship to the resource. So here is where these breakout rooms, what we're going to do, we're going to break out into smaller groups in a more intimate setting where you'll have a chance to interact with one of the storytellers, the ones that you've already heard. And also we have Ryan Benson from the Okanagan Nations Alliance. He's also with us. He's got a powerful story to tell about restoring wild sockeye salmon runs. So what we're going to do is we're going to break out into these rooms. Jen is posting them in the chat section. So you'll see breakout rooms that are set up by your birth month, January, February, that's breakout 1, breakout 2, March, April. So if your birth month falls into those slots, please go into that breakout room. We invite you to share your camera, turn your camera on and your microphone. Go around in the room, briefly introduce yourself, and then start chatting, you know, asking questions, reflect back some of the things that you've heard and how it affected you. What does this mean? What do the Blue Commons mean to you? What does the impact the blue economy has on community fisheries mean to you? Bring those questions out. And you'll also note that there will be a Jamboard for each room, and that will have some of the questions that Andrea posed in her slide presentation. So, take this opportunity to bring out some ideas, some questions that we will tease out after the breakout session. So what you'll do in order to go into the breakout session, you click on the link that's in the chat. You'll go straight into the breakout session where you'll meet up with, there'll be one person from the storytellers, the panels, and one person from Slow Fish who will be there to take notes. And then we'll have about 20 minutes, and then we'll come back here and we'll start pulling apart some of the narratives that we've got here and see what sort of comes to the surface in terms of common themes and maybe common ways to approach replicating these kinds of blue commons types of communities that we've already heard, whether they're in Rhode Island or in Sitka, Alaska.
I can say that my breakout session did not really stick with the questions, but that's okay. We had a great discussion. And we're a little late coming back because we were all ranting a little, which I'm guessing was a common thread. So once we have everybody, I'm going to give this like another minute. It's 3:03. We've got a little over an hour left. We're going to bring on 2 more speakers. But before we move on to our next speakers, we're going to have a little review of how our breakout discussions went. So do we have someone here from, there we go. Hi, Collis.
Hello.
Do we have anybody from room number 1? Are we going to bring people in from each room?
Yeah.
Okay.
I just chased Seth and Paula out, and Seth, of course, said, "Okay, Dad." So either Seth or Paula are on to sort of reflect back on that. So I would invite either Paula or Seth to sort of share back a little bit of what came out of your group, and then we can sort of tease some of that out and then move on down the list.
Great. And I think we had 2 rooms merge. Was it room 6 that merged with room 2?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we'll just skip room 6
Okay.
and meld that in with the room 2 discussion. Perfect. Oh, room 5. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So when we skip room 5, it's not because we're ignoring them. We're not shunning room 5. All right, Stephen's heading out. Thanks for joining us, Stephen. That was fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah. So Paula, do you want to share your audio and video? And then you can maybe sort of give us a bit of a brain dump as to what you all were talking about in Breakout 1. Are you with us?
Just click that request to share audio and video in the top. There we go.
Yeah.
Hey, Paula.
Yeah. So are we all here? Should we wait?
No, you're good.
Okay.
You go ahead and let us
Okay,
know.
great. Well, we were like 4 people plus 2 or 3 more people in the chat interacting. That was great. And we mainly covered two questions. How can we build relationships, trust relationships? And the main thoughts were regarding about how to show that you care about things through actions. So to have a caring approach in the way you interact with people, in the way you interact with, let's say, organizations or whatever, but that is not only we need to move from transactions. No, let's say that it's important to really care about what you are doing and with who you are doing that. And then the other question that we were able to discuss was about the messages that we would like to give others that will be interested in creating collective change. And we were explaining some of the examples, existing examples about MPAs with a co-management governance approach. That somehow is, yeah, Seth was very clever when how he pointed out, because, for example, places like this, like Slowfish, even if it is a virtual gathering, but yeah, Slowfish, Terra Madre, they create the space, the opportunity to exchange, to inspire the others, and then you leave these places with so much energy and willingness to change things. But then once you are at your local community, at local level, you need to create the alternative, not to create the counter example, the action that's gonna change the let's say the situation that your community is facing. And yeah, from this we were like collecting some examples, working examples from the international panoramic to illustrate how creating a counter example could be. So that's all I think. Seth, you can integrate things if you think I forget something.
Thanks, Paula.
Yeah, that was great, Paula. I mean, you know, you get in a room with Seth and you could just keep asking him questions and keep getting answers, and it's just you know, it's just an incredible resource information. Well, there's Seth. You don't need me.
Oh, okay. No, I was typing. No, I think Paula summarized the conversation very well. That's exactly what we've spent our time discussing.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you both. I will just step in real quick here to sort of recap the conversation we had. David Bollier, who will be speaking shortly, giving some context to the story from Ryan Benson from Okanagan Nations Alliance. We were joined by Michelle Mesmin, who is in the same apartment with Seth in Italy. And I just want to just point out that Michelle is just an incredible resource. She has more connections in fisheries than I could possibly ever imagine, probably more than 5 other people that I know. And also, the person largely responsible for Slowfish International and all that work. So very thoughtful conversations around issues like how do you sell the alternative narrative to the blue economy? What are the questions that you ask? How do you present that to people who may be sort of just going with the flow of the way things are, the status quo? And you're going to be challenging preconceived notions, and you have to show what's wrong with the status quo in order to present the alternative of what the Blue Commons is, the types of examples that we've heard already from Sitka, from Rhode Island, and what we're going to hear from Okanagan Nations Alliance. It's this collective community. But as Jess very astutely pointed out, a lot of times in the fishing communities, you don't hear fishermen react until it's a problem in their backyard. And so you have to take the opportunity when the problem is in their backyard to build the context of how the blue economy impact has affected them, and then start to think about this sort of collective, like how can we, treat our resources right in our, right out of our door as a shared resource. So that was one of several things that came up, but that was one of the more salient issues that came up. As Jess said, well-managed fisheries aren't managed to meet, price demand. They're managed to manage the biological demand. And so that's the difference. And we have to start thinking collectively about that and how can we move that forward. So anyway, that's, I think, the gist of it from the second breakout. If anybody else from that group wants to chime in, Otherwise, let's sort of move on down to the third breakout group, which would be Sarah. Sarah, are you with us? Just click share audio video in the upper right-hand corner. There you are.
How's it going? So we had, sorry, I'm remembering names, Linda and from Norway, who just spoke. And so we talked a lot about Andrea, about how different parts of the world are working on this. And what's made Alaska unique is maintaining access or keeping access with small scale fisheries and how that is happening around the world versus consolidation. And also we talked a lot about kind of showing the true value of a fishery besides just the pound per catch, that folks kind of give it that face value, and having the access as part of that value as well. And we kind of talked about similarities between different regions and differences between like the East Coast and West Coast of Canada, how different those management systems are, and then in Europe and Alaska, essentially how different communities are going about keeping access with small scale folks and putting funds aside for that. And Andrea, feel free to hop in and add in, because I knew you and Linda were really driving the conversation. I don't know. All right, cool. Well, back to you guys.
Great, thank you, Sarah. I think Seth is supposed to be up next. Yeah, there he is.
Hey, Jess. Hey, everybody. Okay, so I was in group 4 with Ryan. If you want, Ryan, hop up with me and feel free to chime in, but no pressure. Ryan's going to share his story again pretty soon. But we had a great conversation. I think some themes that popped out, yes, were this big question of just who owns the ocean, and there's something I don't know, inherently contradictory where kind of we all own it, and at the same time, no one owns it, and at the same time, it's increasingly being owned and controlled by a few different folks. We talked about how some of the examples of commoning and the results of them can be often so site specific, and how do we really hone in on some of the core values that are fundamental to commoning models, which Andrea highlighted it. So how do we kind of pull some of those into our own common language so we know exactly what they are? There's a good comment about just focusing on the local innovators, the stories, kind of like what we're doing today, to share them and spread them so we know them and we can let them grow. And then one other thing before passing it to Ryan was this is building off a bit of what Collis had shared from his group around this question of how do you present the ideas around commoning? How do you get folks interested and moving in that direction? And there's something that's almost inherently, I don't know, like there's inherent tension between talking about what is a very strong process-oriented approach to doing stuff together, whether it's managing a resource or fish or something else, where it's very decentralized, it's bottom up, and it's organic by nature, right? Like when you engage in that process, you don't exactly know what the outcome's gonna be, but we're talking about something that just fundamentally believes in a process. And so that butts up against a strong culture that values top-down authoritative single-minded models, and that are very outcome oriented and actually reject thoughtful processes. So how do we present this idea and really promote process essentially over outcome? I often get asked the question if we're critical of something like catch air programs, well, if not catch shares, then what else? What, you know, then offer something else. And our response is always like, well, there's no one size fits all. There's no one solution that will be right for every fishing community. And so what we're really talking about is promoting values in a bottom-up process. But that's not an easy sell. And it's, I think, can be scary for folks that need like tangible outcomes. So those are some reflections. Ryan, anything else you want to share?
Just to throw in there real quick about, you know, I guess the so-called ownership, and we had a sort of funny, just the way the Canadian resource management is officially still owned by the Queen. And I know Sally had a bit of just a funny just exchange there about, you know, the crown and stuff like that. But even just like jurisdiction, you know, where we are in the Okanagan territory, I can drive 40 minutes from here across into the US, and it's a completely different sort of structure. You know, whereas, you know, on one side, on the Canadian side of the border, it's you know, federal government managed fisheries, and then the province, just within our territory, like less than an hour away, and it's completely different. It's managed by Washington State. And we have, you know, some of our Silks community, which is in the U.S. side, part of the Colville Confederated Tribes, and just the whole idea of, you know, moving away from this decentralized sort of concept. You know, Jason brought it up too with his, you know, the Rhode Island fishery, where you have sort of conflicting jurisdictions even within the same territory. You know, you have the state-run fishery versus the, you know, the big scale private kind of under the federal fishery system. So it's, yeah, I think to sort of progress along, we have to have a paradigm shift away from sort of you know, decentralized and more grassroots, which seems to be a common theme with you know, the discussions up to this point. So that's all I wanted to add.
Thanks, Ryan and Brett. So last up, we've got Jacqueline, who's going to wrap the group 6 for us. Hi.
Hi, I'm going to try to wrap group 6. I'm going to see if I can show you my notes here, because Jamboard was a little odd with me, but can you see that? Maybe not. Maybe not. Okay. Whoa. All right. We won't worry about it. Can you hear me though, Jessica, or anybody?
Hear you.
Okay. All right. I'm going to bounce over to my notes. So I'm not going to look in your face, but we had a great group actually, with a lot of diversity. So commercial fisher people from both coasts in the US, and 2 ardent consumers, and a wonderful culinary historian, and young fishers and experienced fishers. So I felt really blessed to be part of this group. It was really fun. So five key themes came out, I think, all under the overriding umbrella of good communication. So our young fisher brought forth that basic financial security issues are a concern these days that may not have been faced by previous generations. And so our young fishers are looking some pretty big challenges right up the nose, like college loans from getting those higher degrees, high rents that make just basic living security an issue, and having the hope of even buying a house is a far off dream. So when you're worried about, you know, where the roof over your head, that really makes your livelihood concerns that much more urgent. And also the feeling that if you're not in a fishing family, starting from scratch is sometimes an insurmountable challenge. And so that was a good thing to hear, an important thing to hear. And somebody else, well, actually the same fisher, I think, went to a conference, and it was so dominated by aquaculture that you were not able to bring up questions or bring up issues as independent fishers till the question section. And then a lot of voices came forward. So the idea of having dominance in any discussion by anybody to the exclusion of other voices is so detrimental to where we need to be now. And then Stephen, who is in our group, so wonderful, talking about going to Thailand and finding some similar concerns there, including what we would call a brain drain, in that young folks are going to college, obtaining advanced degrees, and then actually having to move out of Thailand and then come to places like Vancouver to gain useful employment. So some of the more energetic, rigorously trained young folks are actually completely leaving the area. And along with that, in addition to not having folks that would normally have gone into fishing, you're also losing people who would go into welding and other professions necessary to keep the whole fish world afloat. So that's a big issue even in other countries. People not following family footsteps, perhaps in some cases, are not going into jobs that once seemed really important and lucrative in the way of being self-sustaining and essential for keeping the whole community together. And then our food historian has been documenting the water world, particularly in Connecticut, and said something that just stopped me in my tracks, noting that there's one mating pair of Atlantic sturgeon in the whole area that she's been monitoring. And then those of us that are consumers, we're talking about how difficult it is to pin down in the market or wherever where fish is coming from, how it was caught or processed, and who was responsible for bringing it from the water to the shore. And it shouldn't be that difficult as a consumer to know where your food comes from. And when that's put up as a barrier, we get very suspicious. And not all of us have the opportunity to go directly to the dock and buy fish right there. So some labeling concerns as well. And I think that wraps it up for our Breakout Room 6. Thank you all so much.
That's great. That sounds like a phenomenal discussion. And I think that ties back to the overarching discussion, which is if we're using economics to change, the way that we manage our oceans, we should check out how well our economics is actually managing the rest of our culture right now. And I would argue that it's not going very well. So, we have an opportunity to change the way we manage our oceans and not just apply those same principles. And that is actually going to lead us to the final segment of our discussion. We're going to have Ryan Benson, who's a fisheries biologist with the Okanagan Nation Alliance. And then we're going to go to David Bollier, who directs the Reinventing the Commons program at the Schumacher Center for New Economics. And that's going to be right before we go into our final Q&A. However, we think it's really important to give everybody a little break to stretch your legs a little, and then we're going to come back to those conversations. So, Collis, do you want to lead us into that?
Yeah, I'm just going to say, first of all, again, thanks everyone for hanging with us. I mean, these are really important conversations. And I think, like tying into what Jess said, having these kinds of conversations is part of the process for, broadening awareness around, the Blue Commons as a counter narrative. So, this is great. Appreciate everybody for hanging in. It's a good time. Our schedule kind of got a little bit flipped upside down. So appreciate everybody's patience for that. We're going to take 5 minutes here. And then we're going to come back and, we'll just play it by ear. We definitely want to hear Ryan's story. We definitely want to hear David's story, and then we'll get into a Q&A from there, and then we'll see where the conversation goes from there. So thanks again. We'll see you in just a few minutes.
So up next, we've got Ryan Benson, fisheries biologist with the Okanagan Nation Alliance. And I think I'm thinking back to Seth's presentation when he was talking about equity and sustainability. And I'd asked the question, who defines these terms historically on the land? And are they trying to define them for the oceans now?
Okay. So this map shows the traditional Okanagan or Silks territory. It is unceded. There's never been any treaty signed within the territory, and you can see it's pretty extensive. It goes sort of the interior of British Columbia and Washington, all the way to the Continental Divide, sort of bordering the plains area. And right in the middle, you can see the what is unceded territory, and this orange sort of polygons are what the current reserves are, both in Canada and the reservation down in Washington State. So it's a very pretty important watershed. It includes the Upper Columbia watershed, sort of in the Canadian portion. And then right in the middle there, you can see the Okanagan River and the Okanagan Basin, which is one of the largest tributaries to the Columbia River. And so working north from the border, there's Soyuz Lake, and then just upstream of there is Skaha Lake, and then to the sort of into the headwaters is Okanagan Lake, which is that large lake, and it's 135 kilometers from end to end. So it's pretty substantial, probably way more volume and biomass than in the two lakes downstream. You'll notice in the bottom left corner there's Coyote, and he is it's pretty important, and I'll get into that here. So Coyote, or Sinclair in Silchen, he's a trickster, and he kind of does all kinds of crazy and silly things throughout the stories. And one thing, important concept, is Chaptik, which is the oral teachings and stories of Okanagan history. And the main purpose is to demonstrate sort of protocols and how we need to act and behave. And it's kind of like internal silks laws that are passed down on to the next generations. When we use Chaptik, we also have another concept, TEK, which is traditional ecological knowledge. And that's the stories of what the elders and what the experts in the community, sort of how they know about the landscape, and they know about the plants and sort of the interactions, the ecology, sort of at a traditional and Chaptik sort of level. And our department, Okanagan Nation Alliance Fisheries Department, uses the sort of Chaptik and TEK to sort of guide our scientific questions, our research questions, and also sort of guides our management, for certain initiatives and projects, habitat, fixing what's going on and stuff. So Sinclair, actually, he brought the salmon to the Silks people. He went around to all the communities and requested a bride from each of the communities, and there was one valley just to the west of the main Okanagan Valley, and they didn't want to give up any of their wives to Sinclair, and so he said, okay, fine, I won't give you any salmon, and built a set of falls just downstream of the Similkameen River. And so that there's an example of how Chaptik sort of guides our management. The community or the elders won't ever support any kind of introducing salmon initiatives into the valley just because of the Chaptik. So salmon was integral to Okanagan Silks culture, both as part of food and subsistence. Fish were harvested year-round and stockpiled, and it was a huge component of their diet. Another important part is the ceremonial aspect. So in Silks culture, there's 4 food chiefs. There's Intiti, who's actually Chinook salmon, and he sort of is the chief of anything from the water, any kind of the aquatic resources, fishes, and even aquatic plants and such. There's also Bear, who's the chief of the 4-leggeds up on land. Saskatoon, who's the chief of the plant life, and then there's Bitterroot, who's the chief of anything that lives underground. And so with the as part of the food and ceremonial is also a very essential part of the economy historically. And there's documented trade networks going all the way from the coast all the way to the plains, just trading salmon for things that weren't available, for buffalo meat or for seashells, kelp, that kind of thing. Starting in the 19th century, just the settler activity within the region really impacted the Columbia River. Started off in the 1850s with overharvest down in the estuary in the lower Columbia and out in the ocean. And it, over the century and a half, sort of progressed to the hydroelectric dams, which is a major sort of impact to the Columbia River. A lot of times they block migration. There's a little bit of been working on fish passage for the last few decades, but even in Canada, there have been dams that basically blocked all upstream migration. Within Canada, there's been habitat effects, a lot of channelization, just the idea that, sort of the engineering philosophy of trying to get all the water out and to prevent erosion and public safety. In addition, the Okanagan Valley is a huge agricultural industry. There's orchards, vineyards, and with that comes increased water use and water allocation. The Okanagan Valley is actually a borderline desert, just with the amount of precipitation that falls. So it's sort of on the edge in terms of cold water salmon range. In addition, in Okanagan Lake, there is an invasive shrimp called Mysis shrimp. The provincial managers introduced it back in the 70s with the hope of increasing game fish production as a food source. And this was a common practice back in the 60s and 70s in a lot of lakes in North America. And when Mysis shrimp were introduced, the problem is they only migrate to the surface during the nighttime, and so they aren't available for fish. So not only were they not available as a food source, but they tended to mow down the plankton biomass, and in a lot of systems, the fish community completely collapsed. So just the cumulative effects of Columbia River and Okanagan River sort of habitat degradation was a devastating loss to silk people. So this is sort of, compounded the effects of colonization, within the Canadian and also American sort of territory. This resulted in, I believe it was in the late 90s, that less than 3,000 sockeye returned to the basin. And currently, at the time, the most upstream movement migration of sockeye was just north of Soyuz Lake. There's a set of dams that pretty much blocked off the run into Skaha Lake and into Okanagan Lake. So basically, the sockeye population was crashing. The Chinook, probably less than 500, maybe even less than 100 individual Chinook, and that's, if you remember, that is our food chief. So very, very powerful and very devastating. So in the late 90s, the Okanagan Nation Alliance initiated restoration plans, and this was from the request from elders and from community members, Okanagan Nation community members. And so working in partnership with the federal and provincial governments, and also the public utility districts in Washington State, those are the dam operators, they came up with numerous initiatives to help bring back the salmon. A lot of dam passage initiatives, retrofitting, engineering the dam gates so that fish are able to migrate upstream. Habitat improvements, sort of following the idea of natural flow, natural rivers, how they operate, not like a sort of an engineered flume, and also adding spawning gravels where that had declined over the last decades. One of our main sort of initiatives is that it's a water use model. It's a mathematical model and a planning tool, and it allows sort of a prediction of potential droughts within season, and also when the fry emerge from the gravel, and when to release water, not strand them and not scour them out. So a lot of the work of this model has been kind of revolutionary, and there's been, I see a lot of potential in other watersheds within the continent. One of our main initiatives was the reintroduction of sockeye into Skaha Lake. So that's the first lake upstream of the Soyuz that was cut off. And ultimately, the goal was to put them into Okanagan Lake, which is up in the headwaters upstream of Skaha. So beginning in the early 2000s, working with the federal and provincial government, we came up with a reintroduction experiment into Skaha Lake, and that was achieved through planting hatchery fry into Skaha Lake and providing dam passage up into the upstream waters. And currently we're working on moving Sockeye up into Okanagan Lake. And one of the sort of the main sort of functions of this relationship is constant monitoring, adaptive management, we call it in fisheries world. And it's intensive data collection and data synthesis. And the whole idea is that the plan could be reversible if we saw any unintended consequences, other species being, crashing. And so we have a very solid data set, probably one of the richest in North America, especially in terms of, in-lake sampling and food webs. One of our sort of milestones was the construction of the Capeltstum hatchery, which is owned by Okanagan Nation and is located on Penticton Indian Reserve. And you can see from the front, it's very artistic. We had a lot of sculptures from local artists, and it's very sort of holistic of just the silk's philosophy. You can kind of see in the right-hand corner there's a picture of Sinclair bringing salmon up the Columbia. And the word Capeltstum is actually in Silchen for to cause it to come back. So it's pretty powerful and very symbolic. Currently, we have a capacity to raise 5 million sockeye fry, and there's future plans to increase up to 8 million. We have the infrastructure in place. We've also been experimenting with raising Chinook and potentially other species, just sort of, potentially expanding into other satellite hatcheries or using this as the main hatchery. But as far as I know, this is the only hatchery owned by First Nations within the continent, particularly in Canada, and specifically in BC. So currently we're sort of expanding and giving technical advice to other First Nations in the province, for hatchery practices and potentially to expand. So this is a really important tool to help with the restoration of indigenous fish within the territory, and also sort of reaching out to other First Nations in the province. So looking at, I guess, the net impact of all the Okanagan Nation initiatives is there's been a very significant increase in sockeye runs. In the late 90s, I mentioned there was less than 3,000 that came back. To date, our record was in 2010, where we had 210,000 sockeye return to the basin to spawn. And so we've, the run fluctuates year to year, kind of reflects just the boom and bust cycle of salmon runs. A lot of times it's sort of dictated by ocean conditions and potentially factors outside of our control, but we're definitely sort of away from the brink of extinction, which was certainly a possibility within our lifetime. Within Skaha Lake, we've established a more or less self-sustaining sockeye population. In 2011, we'll go back to 2009. That's when the numerous dams downstream of Skaha Lake were retrofitted to allow passage. And in 2011, the first spawning sockeye were confirmed in Skaha Lake and in the channel upstream of there, the main spawning channel. And ever since 2011, we've had a fairly significant run, sometimes as low as 1,500. Those are years when the overall run is quite low, but we had just experienced our record run back this past fall in 2020, where we had 38,000 sockeye return to spawn. So it's pretty significant compared to back in 2010 when there were 0. So fairly substantial, and currently working on expanding the range into Okanagan Lake, which is just upstream of Skaha Lake. Back in 2019, we reconfigured the fish ladder, which was constructed in the dam in the 1950s, but was never set up or activated. So we did that just under 2 years ago, and currently we're working at sort of testing the sort of like the efficiency and passage. Are salmon able to pass? And we telemetry tagged 42 sockeye back in the fall. We let them loose up in the lake to see what they would do, where they would go, and some of them are detected way at the north end, 135 kilometers away. And currently we have detections in some of the main tributaries, but there's probably up to a dozen tributaries, potential spawning tributaries within Okanagan Lake. And so that's very exciting. We're currently just expanding and doing sort of studies to look at what's going on and what the potential is for future rehabilitation. And so with our programs, both with the hatchery and a lot of our habitat programs, we've been able to bring back the recovery of a lot of indigenous fishes within the territory. A lot of them are making comebacks, specifically sockeye and chinook, but we're also sort of expanding into potentially other species. We had a chum salmon show up for the first time in the basin back this fall, so it's very promising. And with that, I'll turn it over back to the main board.
Thanks, Ryan. Where do you think that chum came from?
It came from Washington State, possibly a stray. One other exciting thing is a couple years ago we actually caught a white sturgeon in Soyuz Lake, and there again we kind of looked at the markings, and it came from one of the hatchery programs in Washington State, one of the PUD sort of sturgeon recovery hatcheries, and it just was a good flow, and decided to explore and ended up in a Soyuz Lake. So that's definitely very promising for sure.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. Thanks for that presentation. So I just want to remind everyone to drop your questions in the chat if you have any. Ryan, I think you're going to stick around, right?
Yes, yeah, I'm on till then.
Great, thank you. So up next, we've got David Bollier, who directs the Reinventing the Commons program at the Schumacher Center for New Economics. And he's going to give us a little bit of context, I think, not just for Ryan's presentation, but for everything that we've been talking about today. Go ahead, David.
Do we have the slides that Kaylee was going to show? Because I'm not able on my computer to put them up.
Oh, there she is. Your hero to the rescue. Thanks, Kaylee.
Yeah. Kaylee, I'll just give you cues about when the slide should shift.
Perfect.
Okay.
I shut up in just 1 second here. Let me get into present mode. Is that looking good for everyone?
There we go. I just wanted to give some context and draw some threads together from the conversations we've been having. I'm not a fisheries person, so I don't have the depth, and I've been learning an awful lot today, which I've been grateful to hear. And I've been especially pleased to see how much it really fits into a lot of the larger commons framework and discussion that's going on in a lot of different realms, not just environmental, but digital, urban, and many others. So I want to give a brief overview of the commons to show that there's this larger context, and then I'll try to draw some of the threads out that were presented in the different presentations today. First, one reason the commons is not appreciated is because it's considered that the state and the market are the only two significant systems of power for getting things done. And we seem to say it's either public or private, when in fact the commons is something that breaks that binary, is doing a lot of work on itself. It just doesn't have the language, the vocabulary, the concepts as developed as standard economics, for example, or standard politics. And so the commons is kind of a discourse that helps name a lot of these things we've been talking about today, which I would describe as living circuits of value versus market price as the only metric of value. And so to talk about the commons is to talk about really in a very big, almost existential way, a different way that human beings relate to the world. And instead of us being separate from nature, we relate to nature. And us, instead of being individual consumers or producers, we relate to each other and have interdependence with our fellow producers and community members. So the commons is really a way of reframing this conversation. Why don't you go to the next slide? I'm going to be a little confused here because I don't have the sequence in mind, but go to the next slide, Kaylee. A lot of the problem is that global capital and business want free and subsidized resources that are out there that are either unowned or perhaps, like in the case of indigenous peoples, there's not a Western land deed or property title. And so essentially they've been taken. And that's the way a lot of property gets started in the first place. It's taken. And so the commons is a way to start to name some of these processes, which a term that is often used is enclosure, which is the privatization, the commodification of resources, and the dispossession of people who may have used it in traditional fashions before that. Let's go to the next slide. I want to show you how enclosures are really something that is a phenomena that's maybe the great unacknowledged scandal of our times, in which all things, these living aspects of the world, especially nature, are being turned into commodities, and shared wealth is turned into private wealth and fed into the whole market and property regime of control. And that's, I think, the larger story that we're talking about here. I want to give a quick flyby of some of these different enclosures to give you an idea of the breadth of them. Next slide. There's a huge international land grab going on with hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, normal investors, basically colluding with governments in Africa, Asia, Latin America especially, to seize lands that have been used by indigenous peoples or traditional communities for generations, and to basically steal the land because they don't have title, and to use the power of the state to do that. It's creating basically a situation equivalent to what happened in England in the medieval times. Next slide. 20% of the human genome is now privately owned, which has huge implications of what scientists can study for fear of not violating somebody else's patent. Next slide. And there are countless other market enclosures we could go into in which essentially the price system, private property rights, markets are the regime for governing something with very little concern for the externalities. And the externalities are basically seen as something that somebody else, future generations, government, local communities, non-market players have to deal with. Next slide. And I think the blue economy is a part of that conversation, because we've already seen in Seth's presentation how really it's about creating new markets, it's about investment, it's about privatizing the monetary gains from these living circuits of natural systems. And that's what the commons is really trying to confront with a more coherent discourse that can go toe-to-toe in a more rigorous way than perhaps one-off conversations of don't do this. Next slide. So the commons has to be understood not as an unowned resource, not as a tragedy of the commons, as Andrea explained, which is really more the tragedy of the market exploiting an open access regime. The commons is a social form for meeting needs, and it's extremely ancient. It's part of human history, and evolutionary scientists will say that cooperation is how we've advanced as a species, but it's also very new. That can be seen in the internet and many other contemporary venues. Next slide. It's a peer organized social system, meaning it's from the bottom up, it's horizontal, it's not, at least initially, with state or market involvement. It's usually place committed, and it's not, as I say, it's not just the resource alone, it's the community and its traditions and understandings and geography and history of doing things with the resource and a particular set of social norms and practices for doing that. So it's really one organic system for managing things differently. I think the history of indigenous peoples shows us in a more distilled form and over millennia how rich and how integrated these systems are, and also how successful they can be at stewarding resources without over exploiting them or really treating them in sacrilegious ways the way the market does. Next slide. It's really about bottom-up cooperation and practical innovation, improvisation among peers. It's not an ideological thing. And it's really more of a verb than a noun. There is no commons without commoning. And so instead of commons being about common property and a resource, the way traditional economists or even Eleanor Ostrom, the great commons scholar, approached it, it can be constructively seen as a social process of negotiating within a community. How are you going to manage something? How this is working, that's not. How are we going to deal with that conflict? How are we going to deal with somebody who violates the rules, and so on? And so commoning is really a hardy, ancient form for collectively managing resources independently of the market and state, although in our times it's hard not to have some sort of arrangement, especially when the market and state are kind of jealous of the, let's just say, the competitive potential politically and economically that commons represent. Next slide. I want to go through these quickly, so Kaylee, we'll go, because I don't want to spend too much time on these, but I would just want to show the breadth of different commons out there. There's all sorts of natural resource commons, as you can see here, and an estimated 2 billion people depend upon them for their everyday livelihoods. Yet economists don't regard that as interesting because there's no money being exchanged usually, except in modest marginal ways. So yeah, these are arguably a more stable, ecologically benign way of meeting needs. So it's something that I think we need to refocus our attention on if we're going to deal with the cascades of ecological problems we have today. Next slide. The local food sovereignty movement is part of this. It's about revalidating place-based control, governance, stewardship, feedback loops for how something is governed, instead of simply throwing it open to the global markets and having the insanity of shipping food halfway around the world with all the carbon consequences and the fragility of global supply chains. Next slide. Open source software is sort of this major cultural explosion of this sensibility as well, which has had enormous implications for how digital and software markets operate. But it's also culturally inspired lots of spin-off ideas. But the idea of peers collaborating to be generative and creative in making new products in ways that outperform Microsoft, the way Linux did against Windows, is like a phenomenal story that the market economists can't really understand, but from the perspective of the commons, it makes perfect sense. Next slide. And Creative Commons is an idea of using licenses on copyrighted works to authorize and advance the sharing of works so that they can be collaboratively used. A huge advance that didn't come out of Congress or legislatures because they, of course, are captured by the copyright industries. But this is an area in which knowledge and creativity and information and cultural works are made shareable as commons, an enormous cultural phenomena that's global at this stage. Next slide. So what I want to leave here is the idea of the strategic value of talking about commons. It reframes the discussion so that a lot of these things like fair access and benefit and peer governance are really core issues. But people have responsibilities for their commons, but also entitlements to usage. It's wrapped up with their long-term stewardship of the resource and the commitment to the community. It's about meeting community needs about it as opposed to extractive profits for private gain. And it's really the moral gyroscope of it is really custom and tradition as something that is been ratified by history, you might say, as effective, the way the wisdom of elders in indigenous communities is often so insightful about the best ways to move forward. And obviously, there's limits to market exploitation because markets don't know how to self-limit themselves, and the regulatory state has proven a failure at that. So commons are a way to start to, from the bottom up, through organized action, assert limits on exploitation of resources and start to get more in harmony with living systems of value instead of letting capital-driven ones prevail. Next slide. These are two of the books that I written about that. The one on the right, the one on the left, Think Like a Commoner, is an introduction, which gives a quick short overview. The one on the right, which was just published a year or so ago, is takes the Ostrom framework of the commons a step further by looking at the experiential, subjective, social dimensions of the insides of commons. You know, economists talk about homo economicus, that we're rational, utility maximizing, materialistic, and so forth. That's their paradigm of what a human being is. We wanted to sketch out what we call the patterns of commoning, meaning the behaviors and ethical norms that the inside of commons tend to have as an experiential thing. And we base this on our study or experiences with dozens of different commons, my co-author Silke Helfrich and I, because we wanted to focus not some of external behavioralist or property-based approach to commons, but the experiential dimensions of commoning as people experience it, and therefore how they can start to own it themselves and create it themselves. So this is our distillation of those kind of experiences, and we give it a political dimension too, because state power is often hostile or indifferent to commons and doesn't have law that necessarily empowers them. And property law is often working at cross purposes from commoning as well. So there's some issues of law, finance, infrastructure, and worldview that often have to be confronted when trying to advance commons. But I think that ultimately, because they're based in bottom-up practice, they have a lot of authenticity and moral authority that at some point states and policymakers and politicians are going to have to respect. And we see a lot of victories going on in different areas. I can talk about that more. I think I'll conclude there. There's other issues. Well, I want to make a few comments about the other speakers and relate some of that to this. I mean, I think we've seen with like the quahog harvesting that it's a subsistence and livelihood oriented thing that is grounded in local custom and culture. And it's about eco stewardship as opposed to, you know, the market exploitation in the conventional ways, especially as driven by capital. And similarly, as we just heard with Ryan's presentation, you know, it's about the connections to the land. It's about culture and economy and foods and ceremony, ritual, all of these being organically integrated and having a respectful gift relationship with the quote resources. I like to call them care wealth instead of resource, because resource implies not having a human relationship with it. So, you know, I think that we can see some through lines in some of the presentations we've heard about how, especially local fisheries, they have a history and set of cultural relationships that deserve to be honored, because arguably they know that resource far better than a investment fund based in New York that is simply there to extract as much financial gain as they can out of a natural system. So I'll just leave it at that, saying that I think the commons has some great strategic value in starting to confront some of the very powerful lines of argument, normative lines of argument in our political society today, to validate ways to protect fisheries and the related resources, as well as the cultures and communities that are bound up in those systems. So I'll just leave it there, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was fantastic. Great context. Feel like, we could dive into your presentation for at least an hour, which we don't have, unfortunately. But I know that there was a lot of really good conversation in the chat happening while you were presenting. And yeah, so Tracy has a good comment too there in the chat. And I just want to say thank you to you and to everyone who's presented today. I know that we were hoping to move on to Q&A next. We're supposed to be wrapping up at 4:15, so that leaves us 7 minutes. So I'm going to have Collis come on and guide what's happening next. I think we might be just trying to wrap up and skipping Q&A, but we might want to try to squeeze in a couple of questions. Give us a little note in the chat if you don't mind staying on for another 10 or 15 minutes to ask some questions and get some good dialogue going here before we close out the week.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you, David, just really in depth. And I mean, there's so many ways to look at, threads that are connective here. As Michelle said in the chat, it's about forests, it's about land, it's about, coastal line, it's about fishing grounds. It's as Ryan said, it's our connection to the resource. And if we don't really respect that, not on an individual basis, but as a collective, then we're going to keep running into these issues. And so we have to be thinking spatially about that.
And I think that means developing a different kind of language for talking about it, because in the course of doing some of my research, I kept choking on the word resource. I kept finding that if you just focused on individual agency without thinking about the larger collective agency, you weren't going to make headway, and you weren't representing the collective interest of everybody. But of course, as Andrea pointed out in her presentation, finding the ways to move towards shared purpose and collective cooperation is a challenge. And it doesn't happen overnight, but it becomes very hardy and powerful and generative when you can do that. And very, I'd say, even a deeper knowledge, the way Indigenous peoples have taught us.
That's it. And I mean, that theme came up every time someone spoke last Saturday during the Indigenous Access to Food Systems discussion. It's understanding that we are living in harmony with nature, and therefore nature provides, as long as we live in respect with it. And they do that as a community. They don't do it just as an individual. So when they harvest salmon, they all agree on when they're going to do it, and then they know when to stop, and they know how much to keep reproducing and all of that. And we as a society of non-Indigenous folks have gotten so far away from that. So I guess my question is, this is sort of like for this whole conversation, how do we carry this forward? I mean, we've had a great conversation here. How do we carry this forward into the Slowfish Network and beyond? So that, trying to get people to think outside of what their status quo is to them. How do we do that?
I think it's a long process, but I think strategic workshops are a really valuable vehicle for getting key innovators and thinkers who are committed to the idea together, and to get a kernel and nucleus of actors, and highlighting those who have taken the lead in starting to federate among projects, because there's going to be a lot of very different localisms, but getting a vehicle, perhaps workshops, perhaps conferences, but places to trade those ideas, the way the past 3 hours have been such a fertile exchange of ideas. I mean, there's so many things that have popped up that I think people need to start to integrate into their own practices. Anyways, those are a few initial ideas.
Yeah, and it all seems to come back to values, though, right? I mean, it's like if you're centering on a shared set of values, and that's kind of what we talk about with Slow Fish. It's like we're all centering around a shared set of values. Yes, there's going to be some differences in there, But if you center around a shared set of values, like Michelle says, by doing that sort of the community accountability thing, you make each other responsible to each other. And therefore, that's the strength of the community.
That's right.
So maybe that's something to carry going forward. Yeah, I mean, again, I want to, you know, this has been great. We're going to, as we said before, we're taking all of the questions that have come in on the chat, and we're going to feed them in. Tomorrow is going to be the main focus for tomorrow is that we're going to take the key themes that have come out of every one of the discussions that we've hosted during this event, and we're going to distill them down into 2 or 3 core threads from each discussion, and we're going to reflect them back to the group in terms of where the threads are connected and what storylines are sort of dovetailed in how they affect the slowfish community and how they affect the slowfish community now, and what we're looking at, what slowfish will look like down the road. The Blue Commons and this discussion is really important in that, because a lot of the values of good, clean, fair, those are all rooted in sort of the commoning that we've talked about here. Thanks to Seth Macenko, Jason Jarvis, Linda Benkin, Stephen Rhodes, Andrea Nightingale, which is very late in Norway where she is, Ryan Benson, David Bollier. Also want to thank Jess Hathaway, fabulous facilitator. She did great. Also want to thank Kelly Collins Geyser, our MC of all MCs, as well as the people who made all of the technical glitches in the background go away. Kaylee Mazzocoli and Jennifer Halstead, you guys are rock stars.